All right. Hi, guys. We are gathered here today to discuss this one, White Rage by Carol Anderson. Um, so I was thinking that maybe today we could get this party started with a couple of selections from the book that I think frame up the conversation. And in thinking about this, like the series has been super interesting, right? Because it's like every book is going to make you kind of jump into the material a little bit differently, right? Like some of the ones that were hard, it's like, guys, this book was really hard. Some of the ones that are thick, it's like we read everything, right? And with this one, I feel I'm like, oh man, the title of this one, White Rage, makes me personally feel like, all right, let's just go directly to the book because it makes me too nervous to even enter the conversation another way. But with that in mind, I felt like it was useful to acknowledge that discomfort, right? Like this is the first one that I've been like, oh man, hmm, I don't even know. And there's something about the title itself that did that. So I have been I've been trying to be like open and honest in these conversations. And since that was a big thing that was in my mind, I felt like if I wanted to leave these conversations feeling that I've been open and honest, that I needed to acknowledge that. So I feel like with that in mind, the prologue of this book um, stood out to me. So she starts, although I first wrote about white rage in a Washington Post op ed following the killing of Michael Brown and the subsequent uprising of Ferguson, Missouri, the concept started to germinate much earlier. It was in the wake of another death at the hands of police, that of Amadou Diallo, a West African immigrant who, stepping out of his apartment in New York City, was mowed down in a hail of NYPD bullets on February 4th, 1999. What does it mean to open this book here in April of 2021 when she's looking back, right? She's looking back twice, and one of these twices is 1999. What were you doing in 1999? And do you have a memory of the Amadou Diallo killing it off?
I do not, and I was senior in high school, so it seems like I should have heard of something.
What did that paragraph smack you guys in the face like it smacked me? Or maybe I'm the only one holding my stinging cheek here.
I had heard of about Amadou Diallo before, but maybe only a couple of years ago. In 1999, I was busy being an eighth grader in rural Indiana, and the news didn't reach my radar. But it is it does strike me hearing you reread that, Sherlanya, and having read it as well. Just how I believe that actually Carol Anderson, the author, ends the book in a similar fashion. She lists a series of unspeakable acts of violence against Black people at the hands of the police, and that runs throughout this book. This weaponization of the criminal justice system against Black people, and it reminded me of others. Very eloquent, much more eloquent positions that people have taken. One of which is the creator of The Wire, or I guess one of the co-creators of the TV series The Wire, David Simon. He wrote an op-ed, I think, in one of the Baltimore newspapers at the time when one of the actors in his TV series, who was from Baltimore and kind of like a native, and they were one of the actors who he picked from streets of Baltimore, kind of, was arrested for possession of drugs. And he wrote an op-ed called "We're living in two Americas. My country is a horror show." And that really like hit me, this like how just different totally different the experience is of being in a public space. As a Black person, you're in America a suspect in a way that you're not with as wearing a white skin. So it's confounding, like it's deeply upsetting. And thank goodness you were talking about all these kinds of different media that we've explored over the course of this series. Thank goodness that this book isn't a super long book. I mean, this book was hard to get through for me. And it was not the biggest book, the longest book that I read as part of this series, but it was one of the hardest hitting. I think it just very, very concisely draws this line between current realities in America back to the past, where lynchings were happening with regularity. It makes me think of a lot of different things. One of the things that you tend to ask in these discussions, Sherlanya, is, okay, so like everybody's coming into this with different experiences and different media. And one thing I thought of when I was chewing on that thought earlier today in anticipation of this discussion was Star Wars and Master Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, saying that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to, January 6th, 2021. There's just this, like, there's so much I think rage is part of this title. Another book that came to mind, a book title that came to mind was White Fragility, and how those two emotions are hand in hand, right? Where like rage and fragility or fear are in effect. And I think that's what allows the majority of Americans to, for so long and for so confoundingly consistently over decades and decades, to go, oh, we got to give the cops the benefit of the doubt. This is just, they're doing their job and Blue Lives Matter or whatever. So many excuses, because there is this unspoken, there are these really deep emotions, that we are not really good at discussing. We are not, as Americans, really used to having conversations like these, right? To say nothing of unpacking, like, reality. It's like we don't, in polite company, talk about these things. It's just too high risk. It's like, yeah, I think I'll stop talking. It was a long-winded intro. Gosh, I'll let someone else talk.
The question, okay, so I was like fourth or fifth grade when that 99 killing happened. I honestly skimmed over the name in a way, where it could have been any name, just because in my life, like, constantly there's this exact same story in the news. But it kind of made me think about one of the Black Lives Matter protest chants that I heard a lot this summer, where it's call and response, and it's say his name or say her name. And sometimes the response is a certain name given on who's been murdered this week. But one of the other responses is which one. And I think that kind of ties into like how I just felt about that name. I didn't know that case. I was not aware when I was in fourth or fifth grade of that case, but it's one that I'm familiar with. It could have been any name, honestly, which is pretty terrible. But yeah, that's.
You guys are like, I was in elementary school, I was in middle school. I'm like, I was partially, I was halfway roughly through college. And so I think that I think being in college while something like that is happening it means that it's just going to be, um, may mean, depending on who you are and who you're talking to and where you are, it means that it's going to be like something that's like in the air. I definitely remember that. You know what I mean? Like you know, um, I remember a lot of I remember it coming up, I remember it being discussed like in the way that everything is discussed in college for some people. And that's the thing that I'm trying to get better at too. Like, I make a lot of in my daily conversation or in a lot of these conversations, I think that I've made a lot of assumptions like, oh, well, when one is in college, and then what percentage of people do that, right? And what percentage of people go to, the kind of university and have the sort of experience where like you're hanging around having those kind of conversations. And so even in answering that, one thing that this series has made me want to do, right, is be more aware of all of the different, even more aware of all the different things that we're bringing into the room, right, and how a conversation can go differently. Like if you're trying to have one and you're making like these blanket statements like, oh well, as one does in college, like that, you're bringing a lot into the room when you do things like that. And I heard myself doing it again, so again, I just wanted to call myself out for this thing that I'm trying to be better about. But and when I say that, like I'm not like an extremist. I'm not like I shall pretend like that's not who I am. That's not what I'm interested in doing. But what I am interested in doing is acknowledging, you know, um, that assumptions like that can stop a conversation um, or just you know how those things impact whatever particular room that we're in. Um, so the other selection that I wanted to bring from this book, because because the title is provocative, right? Because rage is one of those words where rage is not ambiguous or an ambivalent word at all, right? Like when you think about rage, you are thinking about something very specific, something potentially volatile, something very powerful, something perhaps uncontrolled, right? Like it is a very particular thing. And so, when you have like I feel like a lot of things that like I have heard or watched um during this particular era is like, wait. You're not talking about me, right? Like that feeling. And so like I think that that's why this title is making me like feel like I have to be like super responsible and like laying some like cones on the field and like go to the point of what the argument that Carol Anderson is making. So this is that prologue again, and she's gone through she's gone through some matters of history, and then she resumes. That led to an epiphany. What was really at work here was white rage, with so much attention focused on the flames. And here she was referring to post, Ferguson. Everyone had ignored the logs, the kindling. In some ways, it's easy to see why. White rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a large range of government bureaucracies. It wreaks havoc. Can't read today. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, too imperceptibly, certainly for a nation consistently drawn to the spectacular, to what it can see. It's not the Klan. White rage doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, or take to the streets. Working the halls of power, it can achieve its ends far more effectively, far more destructively. In my Washington Post op-ed, therefore, I set to make white rage visible, to blow graphite onto that fingerprint and trace its historic movements over the past 150 years. And I feel like that paragraph there does a really good job of encapsulating the book, right? It's like, okay, so we think about rage and the explosive is what you think about, right? And she's like, all right, so we're going to talk about white rage, and what we mean here is the system, right? Like that's another question or another knee-jerk reaction that I shouldn't say knee-jerk, because that implies that it's only a gut response. But I feel like I've heard or watched people struggle with the idea of systemic racism, right? Like I think that that's a term um, that I'm not sure what I think that people hear when they hear it, but it's clear to me that different people are hearing different things. And here she makes her argument for what the system is, or what one set of cogs or gears in the system are. Um, and so I feel like that is a good place to sort of open this conversation in terms of how was, Lauren, you already said this book was rough to get through. I'm curious what you guys' experience reading through this book was.
Go ahead, Marissa.
um, this book was, I mean, I was drawing a lot of parallels to the possessive investment in whiteness, just because it kind of at its root, it's about white supremacy, and intentionally dismantling any progress, I guess is maybe a way to say it. And this one kind of went even farther back than the possessive went, to Reconstruction. And I guess I was thinking so much about how we just like don't teach this or talk about it. Yeah, I don't know. I had a lot of thoughts.
In some ways, we teach the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Because like we hit those major points. We were like, all right, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And it is constructed as this onward positive arc, right? And this book makes a very different argument, right? So like in some ways, this is like you know, an argument against the things that we're taught, even in addition to like shining light on what is omitted, right? It's also like shining light on how those omissions create a false narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting because with reading a lot of these, some of the information starts to be like, okay, we're talking about the war on drugs, and I'm like, okay, like I feel like I have a better grasp of that than I did before doing these readings. But I think that the more aha moment that this title has, and the language that she's using is really calling it out of, this is intentional. And I think that for me, even someone who is probably more aware than others, at least at some level, that yes, there is systemic racism. My gut reaction, my like instant reaction is, oh, that's coincidence, or like, did they really do that? Or did they really do that? Or sort of this belief that a lot of legislators and people in power, mostly white men, are doing things not maliciously, but because they're steeped in, well, this is the way it is, and not thinking it's not intentional that like I want to oppress this group. It's more like, well, this is the way I do it, and I'm supporting my constituents, and so of course I raise them up in this way. And I think this is the first book that really got me to be like, no, this is people very specifically choosing, I want these voters to not vote. I want these people to have power because I believe if another group gets power, it's going to take it away from this group. So I'm going to very intentionally choose my actions, as opposed to like, I mean, we had previous presidential administrations that were using language from Nazi Germany, and it's like, oh, it's just a coincidence. Like, no, we are way past coincidence. We are much more. And I think that that's where the title of this really evokes, like, no, we're calling it out. And I'm going to call out, like, this is done with malicious intention, not because I'm used to living in this type of society. And as much as I was like, because I was thinking this book's shorter than the New Jim Crow, I do wonder if would be harder to get people who are not otherwise believing that they're in a system of racism because of the title, because it is so provocative.
I don't know. I think that like one thing that we have to think about as people who have read multiple ones of these books in close succession is like, what is your experience? How has this changed the way that you see it? You know what I mean? Because like, if you've read like multiple ones of these books, there's so many mental drawers that you have to put information in, right? And like, it's not a situation where you're like reading from one author, right? You're not like, so I think that one of the experiences of stacking the material up on each other is one that's at our table here. You know what I mean? Because like you were saying, you're like, all right, I can tell we're getting it before they say war on drugs. I can tell that that's where we're getting into. That's because you made all these drawers for yourself now, and you have like all of these. You have like so many examples from these things, and I wonder if, in some ways, like that's part of what makes it makes this information more digestible, right? You know, like when we think about the stories that we accept as was like American history, we have heard those stories so many times, you know, in so many different ways from when you are like a little sapling, right? And that's why it's so hard to integrate other information, right? Because like there's certain things that you've heard 1,000 times, you know what I mean? Like you're watching the Thanksgiving special of some show that's telling you this untrue story of what happened, and then you heard it when you were 3 and 6 and 9 and 12, right? And then your sponge already has that in there, and you know, and I feel like when you read a bunch of these books, like your sponge has different stuff in there now, and so I'm curious. I mean, and you know, but to get back to your point, I think that provocative titles can go like both ways in some ways, right? Because like, you know, what's easier to pick up, whether, for example, the possessive investment in whiteness versus white rage is easier to pick up. That depends a lot on like personality, you know what I mean? Like one feels dry and like maybe it's authoritative, right? Maybe it's neutral. One feels like, oh, this feels like it's not passionate. Perhaps this is for me. And the other one feels like, what is going on over here, right? And white fragility, you know, to go back to that book, like that one has a very different feeling too. These are 3 of them just choosing because they all have white or whiteness in the title, and those titles hit you very differently. You know, and I know that there's a lot of criticism or a lot of backlash against white fragility, but like a lot of people who picked up that book had like no drawers to put anything into. And it's like, you gotta start somewhere. Like if somebody read something and that's the one thing that they read, I'm not gonna be mad at that person because like that's the thing that made them feel like they could walk up to that door. And I'd rather them walk up to that door and like go there than like just be like no doors, no doors. But like there's one like white fragility, you know, like those 2 words together feel like I imagine they feel like, you know what, I'm not going to tell you you're a bad person, right? Because it's I think that one of the ways that racism and white supremacy hurt white people is that like if anytime the word like white comes up, you don't know where somebody's coming from. You know what I mean? Like you don't know if you do not know what is behind door number 7, and do you want to find out, right? And that's one thing that like this system has done, because in some ways you're like, I know that there are bad things and maybe I've done some of them, but I didn't mean to do them, and blah blah blah. And so like so the very whisper of that word just feels so different. You know, I watch it. I cannot know that from the inside, obviously, but that's what it seems like. You know what I mean? Like people are like, I don't know. And that's why sometimes in some of these discussions, people are like, here's my CV on like why I'm not a racist. Can I stay? Right? Because because that's what it means to live in a system that has like all of this stuff going on. And that's one of the examples of where like, that's just like this jack in the box everybody's walking around with, you know. And once I feel like people of color walk around with the jack in the box of not knowing when some racism is just going to come out and bang them, right? And then I feel like white people walk around with a different jack in the box that came out of this system.
So true. I just what you just said, Shalanya, reminds me of the activist and writer Adrienne Marie Brown, who said something or wrote something that I happened across last summer that was very welcome to me as a white man. She wrote something to the effect of, okay, hey everybody, George Floyd's killing just happened, and this is a message to white people who are reading my blog. Welcome. Like, if you got here, like, you don't need to. You got here now. Like, you didn't get here too late. There's no too late. Like, you got here, so good. Like, you started. It gets back to what you were saying, Shalanya, about doors, right? Like, the doors are most assuredly shut on this type of history of America. For most people, I would guess, most white people, I would guess. It was for me. And I'm not happy about the fact that I've been sitting here like the past couple of months reflecting on coming up on a year of on the anniversary of George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, and how that sort of sparked these conversations across the nation and the world, and at AADL, addressing anti-Black racism in America. And I think that just speaking real briefly personally, people in my family had different reactions to that. But one reaction was, what are we supposed to do? Like, oh my God, like, kind of just building on what you were just saying, Shalanya, there was this feeling in my family of, what are we supposed to do now? Or can we not be white? And I mean, in these moments, I gotta, I like to go back to kids' books. Generally speaking, all of like the tough, like philosophical questions are raised somewhere in the picture book section of the library. And, that this is no different. There's a book by a white mom who wrote a book called Not My Idea. And cannot remember her name right now, but the gist is talking about how getting at these really deep questions and entrenched systems of violence against Black people in America, and how you can be a white person and not accept whiteness per se. And whiteness is this, it's a complicated question, and it's one of those things like, oh my God, we raise our eyebrows, what's going to happen behind this door kind of a thing, because we're not in practice of thinking about that. We're certainly not encouraged as a society to really interrogate the notions of white and Blackness. And it's frustrating. And I think that's part of why, I'm trying to just be a little gentle with myself coming into a year of really trying to think consistently and hard at these proper series of discussions over a course of a year, but it's a start. And I think that's one thing that I think we got to that place in my family of at least among my inner peoples, just acknowledging that, okay, this isn't about, we don't need to turn this into, that is not, rather it's an opportunity to like try to dig a little bit deeper and realize that like looking and listening and remembering is a start. And another thing that I'm thinking about, which is I think related, is an editorial written by a politician in Minneapolis named Jeremiah Bay Ellison. He represents the north side of Minneapolis, a ward published at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. It was prior to George Floyd's murder, where he said, like, he's talking about the notion of environmental justice. I had to go, what's environmental justice? I thought I knew what environmental justice was. He was talking about it from an angle of, wait, like, where do the like factories and sewage treatment plants and the stuff the icky stuff that you don't want in your neighborhood, where do those get parked? And who are the people who have to live next to that stuff? And how does living in those areas affect your quality of life and your ability to weather a global pandemic? You know, and that was incredibly impactful to me to read that and get a sense of how, oh my gosh, yet again we're talking about, I thought we were just talking about environmentalism and saving the earth. No, it's all connected to people and how we treat one another. And this is not something that gets solved overnight, but it's never going to get solved if we don't acknowledge the interconnectedness of all of these social ills, I would call them.
Yeah, The Color of Law gets into you're reminding me of The Color of Law a little bit, right? Because it talks about like how housing, how that whole issue kind of touches everything, and that element that you're mentioning is discussed in there. Yeah, you kind of went a lot of places, and I think that they are all related. But one of the things that I have found myself thinking about a little bit is this notion of individual identity versus group identity. Like you'll hear people of color say this all the time. It's like white people get to be individuals. We are always considered like a member of a group, and I wonder how much of that impacts like. And I'll apologize in advance for using this word, but like some defensiveness, right, behind about like what's behind door number 7, right? Because like if you see yourself as an individual, and then suddenly your group identity is being talked about, and you're like you have not had to seriously think about being considered one of a group. Like I imagine that experience is totally different, right? Like you always, like if you're a person of color, especially if you move through mixed spaces, you always have to worry about being one of a, like being with. I was listening to a podcast last night that was about sewing, and it's from there. It's a I found it last night, so I'm not even that familiar with the hosts yet. You know how like you just start listening to a thing to see if you like it. That's where I am. But she was talking about going to this conference that is like important for people who are in the fiber arts places, like if you're like someone who sews, or if you like make fabric patterns. And she was there, she's a Black woman, and she was talking with someone else who was also a Black woman about that place, and being called the other person's name, right? Like after like one person like walking up to the other person that was like oh, I heard your speech today, it was so great. And that one was like, I was at my booth the whole time. You are not talking about me. But like in the way that she told that, like I was listening to it thinking like, yeah, everybody has that story. But like I think that's another example of like, that's a lived example that's just a top of mind, listening to a random podcast that I did not expect to discuss today, about like how some people always are expecting to be like cast as one of a group, and other folks are like, whoa, why would you do this? This is terrible. Don't put me in as one of a group. And I think that's one of the things that makes one of many things that can make conversations difficult, right? Because there are like multiple things to deal with, right? Like if you tried to just do long division and you hadn't mastered your multiplication yet, like you couldn't do the long division, right? And so like if you're not used to sorting out like what is you versus what is a group, and like how it works to be seen both ways, and how do you have both of those things, and that like how then are you equipped to do the next step. And I think that's one of the things that's challenging, again said from an observational peer, right? Because like I am totally talking about things that I cannot know at this point. But that's what I was, as you were talking, I wrote down individual versus group identity. And then another thing that I read something or saw something pass Twitter or something that was talking about like, like, there's nothing wrong with being a white person. But it seems like white identity is what needs to be built, right? Like an identity that needs to be built around something that is not just about not being whoever's oppressed at the time, right? Because like if we return to last week's book, like we see that this is not specific to like, anti Black racism. Like it could have to do with any group that is marginalized or oppressed, right? And it's like, well, like again, from the outside, it's like, okay, these people need something else to identify around, and then that would be useful. However, that is a very shallow reading too, because when we read all of these books and stack them together, you got to acknowledge the intentional pieces of it, because like people are pitched differently. Like some people are very innocent to certain things, other people are absolutely not, right? And when we won't when we don't want to think about it all and start teasing apart anything at all, it makes it hard to have a discussion. Because then, like, if you're talking about the person who's like, listen, we got to round up these Black people so they can't vote, take the franchise forever. And you know what we're going to do with them once we round them up? We're going to go put them in that rural white district so that those people can have more voting power. That person, not innocent. Person who's just like, I know I didn't go to school. I know I have this job. And what happens if somebody else takes this job? Like that person, a little bit more like, yeah, I don't know where they are. These imaginary people, I don't know where that person is politically, but in terms of the system, a little bit more innocent. But we won't tease it out, right? Because like we get stuck at like, wait. Not everybody's the same. And it's like, well, yeah, we know that. Like, I know that, you know that, we all know that. You are not the same as that person you hate. You are not the same as that person who's your favorite. We're all different. But like the way that we are flexible with when we want to use that is what's interesting to me. This book talks about very specific eras. And so I want to, so it's for anyone who's looking at this, because they're like, do I want to read this book? I feel like we should kind of mention, that this book takes us to the era directly following the Civil War, which kind of sets up a lot of the rules and a lot of the parameters and a lot of the seeds of what has turned into a lot of the injustices that we can observe right now. And then we hop to the Great Migration. Like one thing that I think is really interesting and effective about this book is that she kind of hits some of the major points that we hit in the progress narrative, right? So like in your elementary, and I mean that in terms of complexity, American history story, like you talked about the Civil War, right? Like, oh yeah, and then whatever we were taught about the Civil War, she picks up right after that, right? She picks up right there, because again, she argues that the thing that stokes this rage or this system, these grinding gears that she named in the part that I read from, is progress, right? So she picks up not at the Civil War, but at Reconstruction, at the progress. And then the Great Migration, we read about that or we learn about that as like a time when, Black people left the South for more opportunity in the North. I mean, like that's when on your worksheet, I don't think that kids do worksheets now, but on your worksheet in our day, right? You got your 2 to 3 lines. That is what you would be expected to write when asked the question, what is the Great Migration? And so she talks about that and what happens. And then we get to, she has burning Brown to the ground. So we're talking about Brown versus the Board of Education, which is another high point that you hit, and so she really has very deliberately gone to these pieces that we would normally think about as like the road from the dark past when people didn't know any better to our present, where we're just looking forward into a future that's better today, right? And then she talks about rolling back civil rights. Well, of course, you talk civil rights, you're going to think about that unit that you see with Dr. King on it, right? So like that is another one of those touchstones in like your traditional progress narrative history class. And then we get to how to unelect a Black president, right? So we got to, America's first Black president, right? So she like hit all of the heavy hitters in terms of the progress narrative, right? I mean, even now, like if you're trying to have a conversation, I wonder how many times America can't be racist, we've had a Black president, has been said. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And she knows that too. And that's why she hit those points. So, as you were reading through the book, what were you thinking about these? Like, obviously, in my mind, I'm like, oh, yep, here's the standard map with all the regular stops. Well, how did you guys respond to that?
So something that Shoshana said earlier about calling out how this stuff was intentional really hit home with me. In college, I had a professor, and I very clearly remember talking about like housing and law and all this stuff, and like, oops, it was kind of a byproduct. We didn't mean to, but like all these people got oppressed, and like I remember at the time being like, but wasn't that on purpose? Like, feels like that was on purpose. Like, and she was like, it wasn't these men sitting in a room like plotting. And I was like, but doesn't it feel like it was though? Like, it was pretty intentional. And so for me, then it was cathartic to like see, yep, this, it feels on purpose because it is on purpose. So that's a lot of what I've been thinking. And then also like just like weirdly personal. I had lived in Nicaragua when Obama got elected. So seeing the connection of like Reagan to Obama really was just like hitting home for me in a lot of ways where abroad, I mean, I'm glad that it was included, just American imperialism and whiteness and how that was felt abroad, and how like the really very personal effects of the terror that Reagan perpetrated in Nicaragua. I was really glad to see that included in this narrative. Just because it still exists as like a litmus test of like, oh, you're American. What do you think about Reagan? What do you think about Obama? What do you think about the Contra War? Like, it's a like everyone asked me that when I was traveling and living there, and I think that we here in America are safe from a lot of that, and we don't have to see it or deal with it, and we can still say like, why are all these migrants coming? Like, why do we have an immigration crisis, which is also like made up? But to see that like some of those policies are still having a very real effect abroad and also in communities here as well. But I was just happy to see that included.
Yeah, I think there were definitely moments in this where she pulls on a piece of history that I learned, like Brown versus Board, and then realizing, oh my God, that's like, I have perpetuated that system in some way. So I worked a job where we were working with schools throughout the country, and we ended up doing a program in St. Louis. And it ended up being at a Catholic school, which, okay, whatever. And I ended up meeting up with someone I knew there, and she's like, yeah, all the kids go to Catholic schools, even if you're not Catholic. And like, it's just the thing. And then when she's talking about like, no, the way we avoided having to segregate the schools is we just pulled all of the white children out of public schools, put them into publicly funded academies that didn't have to be segregated. I'm like, okay. And 2014, we brought programming to one of those schools because they could afford it and a public school couldn't, and we didn't question it. And I think that was like, I really appreciated this book, like tied in, like, this is how the history happened and how like we stopped learning at this is what the court case was, and this is what it looked like, and like, no, this is how it's still playing out today.
That's a good story. I mean, like, that was interesting to see, like, oh, wait, I like that you pulled that example out and showed how this book is like, so this thing that you might think has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, let's complicate it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I always think is interesting, I feel like now, with respect to the way that people talk about Kamala Harris, and like I'm thinking about, Marissa, what you just said, like with like the Obama thing and like the connection to these policies, and there's something like what I wrote down on my piece of paper. What I was thinking about was like, let a centrist be a centrist. You know what I mean? Like, Barack Obama is not like this surprising figure when you look at like who he is, but then like when we try to, and I'm not saying that you did that because I do not believe that you did that at all, but I think, but I'm reminded of this. But when we like look at him as like this symbol, like then he like all like his edges get sanded off. You know what I mean? And like he is a politician doing what they do. Politicians trade us every day. That's what we ask them to do in some ways, right? Because they're taking care of stuff that we are not taking care of. You know, like they're figuring out we didn't figure out like who was going to fund the roads and how, you know what I mean? Like there's certain stuff that is outsourced to them, but like they trade us all the time. Like that's what they do. Like they trade our interests, they trade our money. And that's, they all do that, right? And I think that sometimes when we get a idea of a person, we let that fall off, right? Like I'm always, you know, because it's like, oh, first black president, blah 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 blah, which is its own thing, and like it should be noted. But it's also like he also was the politician that he is,
Mhm.
and we can maybe hold these two ideas in our head at the same time, but sometimes we don't, or like we're like, oh well, that guy, because he's black, he should have done something else. It's like, well, but we saw who he was though, right? Like we saw his, we saw, you know, all the people who run for president are weirdos anyway. You know what I mean? Like they have like this weird, upsetting amount of ambition that's not for the rest of us, right? And like we saw him making his moves and we saw him like do this improbable thing. So like obviously, um, you know, you're making deals the whole way around if that's what you do. And it's some this book made me think that the new Jim Crow made me think that a bunch of these books make me think that like when you know, or and again, like I think about that with Kamala Harris, who we're not hearing that much about right now, but like it's like, oh, well, we got to interrogate her on that, you know, on that you know, top cop thing. It's like she never said she wasn't, and that's what her job was, and she did it the way that she did it. And like when we hold, we just, I think we do something interesting um to, I think that we do something different to politicians when they come from unrepresented groups than we do when they're white, right? Like it's like they're I think that politicians also are often are symbols of something, but I think that when they're people of color in particular, like we put something else on them in addition to who they are. And I think that that's interesting. I think it can happen to women too, but I don't see it the same way um, as we do with people who aren't white.
I think that, you know, we're so, it feels like we're so intentionally told everything is binary. It's either, you know, you're either this party or that. They're good, you're good, they're bad. There's no definitives. And it's really interesting, like dealing with the pandemic where people have to make judgment calls about lots of different things. Like, is it better for my kids' mental health to have them go to school, even though our family might be more at risk? Or should we do this thing or that thing? And there's no like clear answer, and people are freaking out because they can't be like, I'm doing it right and you're doing it wrong. It's like, I kind of need to do a thing. And I think with politicians, we want to put them in that box. And with lots of things, it's like, okay, you're part of my party, therefore everything you do is good. And you're part of the other party, so therefore everything you do is bad. And it's like, okay, so when you then have someone who has a different identity, you know, you put okay, they're part of my party, but they're a different gender, they're a different race. Well, are we talking about them differently now? Like, what does that mean? And I think that we're told like put it in a box, and that just ends the story so quickly that like politicians do lots of different things and you shouldn't like all of them, you know. Like they're trying to work with lots of people's different constituencies. And but that idea that like with white rage is if they're doing something something good for someone else, it's bad for you. And the fact, so therefore it's like people making decisions that are good for you or bad for you. It's like, well, it could be intentionally good for someone else and it will lift all boats, but we're not going to hear that story. Like, we're going to hear the story of it's not good for you.
Mhm. Wow. Shoshana, thank you for bringing that in. I think that has definitely been buzzing around my head as I read this book. And I mean, it really like, we see that inability uh, to engage with complexity on a lot of levels. And Shalana, I think you were touching on it earlier when you were talking about like the notion of like systemic racism, and even defining it is very difficult for people to grok. And people have a hard time hearing, white people, I think, have a hard time hearing, hey, what you said there was racist, or what you did there was a little bit racist. The tiniest pushback builds such indignation, because right, that's like the red line that's the third rail for white people to hear. That is, it's so that's like radioactive. I don't want to touch that. I don't even want to think that I could possibly be that, because Shoshana, you know what you're saying, like how those people over there are bad. You're one of the good ones. You're okay. I think that's something that we don't do so well as white America at appreciating the complexity of our reality and our complicity and our participation, let's just say, in like social society. And I think like it's really hard for people to hear that a term like to hear negative feedback on themselves, and to think in other ways beyond they're winning, so I must be losing, right? Because we have winners and we have losers, right? And that's how it is. And it makes me wonder just how deep that goes. I suspect very deeply. It's deeply embedded in who we are as I think Americans, to think in these terms, or white Americans to think in the terms of, all right, well, I am a rational, moral individual, and I don't really have to think about the society, the system that it's built upon. I'm free to operate as an individual. I don't have, my actions are my own, and that's the story. Rather than to think about just the infrastructure that allows me to think in those terms and encourages me to think in those terms. And I don't think, and this is me projecting, but I suspect that is not the case for the average Black American. They aren't afforded the luxury of thinking of themselves as autonomous, they can be judged on the quality of their character or whatever. It's not an option.
I feel like I want to like return to W.E.B. Du Bois on this one, right? I think that for a lot of people, they see what other people see, but they know who they are too. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know that you're like this, you're a full person doing all the things. You just know that like a bunch of people probably can't see that in you, right? So I feel like there's a push and a pull with that, right? And I think that there's like a different way, maybe like if you're, and I think individuals are different too. Like some people like to think about the things other people don't in any group, but like if you are watching, if you've been around a bunch of different kind of people in a significant way, like I'm not saying like you wave at them as you walk past their house or something like that, that all different kinds of groups have all different kinds of people, right? Like that's a fundamental piece of knowledge that you have because your experience has taught you that. So like you've got a whole bunch of different drawers, right? And I think that there are some ways that different people, because of the way that they interact in the world, just have different reference points, right? Because you're like, okay, or like you can observe like somebody was telling a story about like how he started to learn about like how different races are regarded because he saw it in his own family, like a difference in the way that like his father would interact with people to their face and then talk about them behind their back differently, right? And like he saw a contradiction, and so that like opened his brain. Like I think there are lots of different reasons that give us different drawers to sort of stack different things. But something that you were making me think about, that I've been thinking about a lot during these readings is, when you're talking about winners and losers, I think that sometimes the goal is to like make people look at the wrong person, right? Like I think that sometimes there are winners and then there are losers and losers and losers and losers and losers. And if you make all these losers think that these losers are the reasons why they're the losers in the, in the scenario, then these winners up here who are calling all the shots for all of these people get to stay there because they'll have the support of the people who identify with them, right? And I think that and so like extending that idea a little bit, like like you hear, like I said it today, like people talk about the way that racism or white supremacy hurts the white people too. I wonder if a better way to think about that is like, yeah, sometimes white people are the collateral damage in this racism. And like there's something that someone, I don't remember specifically what it was, but someone who I went to high school with who's white, and they were talking about something, and they were saying, I didn't have privilege because blah blah blah, and it was like some kind of economic, it was like one of these economic arguments. It was like, and when I read it, I was like, what you don't understand is that you have been the collateral damage. All this privilege that you were saying that you don't have, you didn't have it because your family wasn't able to get out of this black district or this blackening district fast enough. And so like you are impacted by this thing that you think that other people are being, you think you're missing out on something, and it's the wrong thing. You have your eye on the wrong prize. Like you were the collateral damage because you were one of the people who was in this school, that was in the school system and in this community that was mixed. And your family didn't get out fast enough. So you didn't get to have the nice school that you were telling us that you didn't get to have. But it's not, but you have your eye on the wrong reason, like you're mad at the wrong thing. It's like, oh, sorry, you got in our bin. I mean, that's what I felt like when I read that. I was like, oh, sorry, you don't realize that, like, you don't realize that you got stuck in our silo here because you don't identify, you don't identify with the rest of us here in this silo that you and friends got stuck in. You identify elsewhere. And so again, to me, I was like, you just have your eye on the wrong monster here. And that's also intentional. That person doesn't have their eye on the wrong monster on purpose, but the fact that that person has their eye on the wrong monster is absolutely intentional, I think.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think you're right. And I think that observation, I think, is making its way into the zeitgeist more and more often, and that I find encouraging. This idea that like there are the people who are winning, and they are creating this illusion that they're creating this story that other people are naive or gullible enough to swallow that. Okay, wait. The reason why I'm in this trouble is because we're giving too many breaks to this other group over here who's ruining for us, or something like that. And there's a book that just recently came out that I haven't read, but I heard the author talk on the NPR about it, called "The Sum of Us," and it's about this notion that there were these great, like, she starts with this example of public swimming pools and how the cities would get together, right, build these wonderful palazzos where people would hang out. And the idea was, we're going to get all these, like the Poles and the Italians and Jewish people, we're going to get them all together, and they're going to swim together, and it's going to be wonderful. That's good. That's a civic institution that we're building. We're investing in our community, right? And then all of a sudden, Black people show up and want to swim, and instead of allowing that, the city councils across the nation go through these elaborate. They basically decide to shut them down, right? Pour concrete down. That's a bridge too far, right? To do that, and you see that play out not just in the public swimming pools, but in the public schools and in the healthcare and in other the economic opportunities that people are given, and that this pernicious idea of okay, well, everybody is equal until the Black people show up. It's still we really suffer from that. I think that I bring that up too because I think Carol Anderson does a good job in this book, White Rage, of showing that at multiple points in American history, we kneecapped ourselves because enforcing the racial hierarchy of whites over Blacks was more important than success, than greatness. And one example from White Rage that stood out to me was Sputnik, and I didn't really realize that this was I did not appreciate this dimension of how important how important the launching of the Sputnik satellite into space was by the Soviet Union. American politicians were just their jaws were on the floor thinking, oh, holy cow, how did we let this happen? We gotta build better schools so that we get more mathematicians and scientists and engineers pronto. We can't lose. And still, they had to enforce racial hierarchies and still decided to underfund Black schools because that was way more important than achieving great things in space, or it makes me think about how Russia's still in play in our national story today, right? And how there's just a decision that a political party made to go along with a particular candidate because at the expense of, I don't know, all sense, it seems, because it was more important that we get this guy than any of our other priorities. I see a connection.
And it's still about othering, even with the whole, the argument by people who have been oppressed by poor schools, by poor healthcare, all of those still don't want the ultra uber rich to have to pay more taxes because it's well, no, because I have this belief that I'm going to be that. I want to be that. And so I don't want to put a burden on them because that's a burden on me, instead of seeing the burden I'm putting on people I believe below me as a burden on me. It's interesting how people want to free up and aspire to what's above them, but want to climb on what they believe is below them.
Mm-hmm.
To go political for just a minute.
No, it's just all right. So I'm glancing at the clock. All right. So we probably should figure out how we're gonna kind of wind up our conversation today. This book was interesting because it did touch so many things that our conversation was a little far flung because it touches so many things, but it was in fact related to what we're reading in the book. So I guess that my questions, and choose whichever ones suit your fancy. What are you reading along with this, or what do you want to read next? So what did this book make you think about something differently in a way that you think is gonna impact something in your day-to-day, or whatever other closing thought that you might have upon reading and attempting to digest this book?
So I watched a talk about storytelling and social justice, and one of the things that I think Carol Anderson does really well is she uses storytelling to paint that picture. I mean, there are some. I've even like I went a little bit down the rabbit hole and like pulled up YouTube videos and things to like her more recent interviews and that kind of stuff. And in her talks, she like says, this guy's tired, he came home from work, there's no food in the fridge. And she like gets you just within a sentence to be like identifying with this person of like, I'm hungry and I've just got home from work. And that makes the story much more visceral and much more intense for the reader, as opposed to saying a Black man was shot 19 times by police officers. Like, and so that idea of how does storytelling affect the way that we consume and let information impact our lives. And I think that's I'm getting to that point where I want to read, I think, more fiction just from the storytelling perspective, or nonfiction that kind of goes into that, the stories of the people versus the statistics and the policy, because it's been tough to read. And I think that trying to connect with the humanity, for better or for worse, of it, I think is going to be a good next step for me.
I can go. Real quick. I just want to say one of the stories, kind of speaking of which, that really struck me was a story told that Carol Anderson tells in the middle of this book, kind of post Great Migration, pre-Brown v. Board, somewhere in that general vicinity of American history, right, where it's this scene that is set in Detroit, and a accomplished, Black doctor decides to move to let's call it like the lower middle class white neighborhood, to the nicest house on the street, and a mob assembles and starts, the rocks are thrown at his house and he fights back, and it's just a wrenching story, but it got me thinking about Detroit. It got me thinking about how little I know about Detroit history, and it got me thinking about how there's quite a lot for me to learn, because I know the one paragraph summary, right? Like, Black people move into Detroit, white people become incensed, they flee to the suburbs and gut all of the wealth of Detroit. That's the the Reader's Digest version is all I got, and I want to know more. And I'm definitely interested if anybody has any recommendations.
So many thoughts, so many final thoughts. I'm not sure where I want to land. I enjoyed this book a lot. I was thinking about who, we've mentioned this in some other ones, about like, who would you recommend this book to? And it's funny because I did just recommend this book to my dentist, which just because I had a dentist appointment, we were talking about it. I also recommended The Possessive Investment in Whiteness to her. I mean, I've had the same dentist for years and years, so like I felt confident.
I'm just picturing you, Marisa, like in the middle of like a teeth cleaning, like, I think you should get this book.
I was wondering that too, how you made the recommendation. Like,
yeah, I mean, because she knows I work at the library, and so she was like, "What have you read lately?" And I was like, which one of all of these books? And it's probably just these were the most recent ones that I had read, but it's like, yeah, these were actually really good. Which is funny because I was like, usually my mom and I read similar books and then we talk about it. And I was like, do I want my mom to read this? Like, yes, but is she gonna get something out of it? Yeah, I think she will, but is she gonna, like, I don't know. It's a toughie. So I'm gonna just see who else I can recommend this book to and who will read it, and then talk with them in private, because it is a different experience talking in private than it is in these. There's definitely some lower anxiety of like, oh, what stupid thing did I say? How ignorant did I sound? Hopefully not too bad. So yeah, gonna recommend this some more to some people and see how that goes.
Cool. I it's funny that you'd think that I would have answers to all these questions, especially since like I usually know what I'm going to ask, but I have to think about this one. I think that one of the things that I was thinking about during this book, and it's something that I thought about during some of the other ones, is and maybe it's like coming from this idea of like politicians like moving us around to like little chess pieces. Um, but I feel like with I feel like with Black people in the US, you know, there's always this, I feel like there's always a different push and pull in addition to the one that this book talks about. But I always feel like there's this like, how do we get rid of you guys now? Right? Like there's been a couple of, you know, things where it's like, let's just ship them all to Liberia. Let's resettle them somewhere. Okay. Like I just feel like there's always this like, okay, we don't really think that we need you anymore. And so how can we throw you away? And this book, like some of the other books, made me think about that. And I think that that would be I actually think that that would be an interesting history course, like the attempted binning of Black Americans. And then like you could just go through history and look at all of these points where it's like, how do we throw these people away? And sometimes like their whole person, sometimes merely their votes, you know, sometimes the intellect. How do we just make sure that these people have no access to what one would need to be as much as you could be within the context of this society? Maybe it's sometimes, you know, Lauren, like you were talking about, maybe sometimes it's just the bodies, right? Like, well, maybe if none of them can have health care, maybe they're all wither, you know what I mean? And that feels like an unspoken truth of like this country's approach to Black people. But I also think that that's this nation's approach to other people as well. Like that specific thing, I think applies very much to different groups. Oh, well, you've worked on these railroads now. Can you go back to where you came from? Oh, I love this cheap fruit. I don't want anyone here. Like that particular element, like this, you know, I don't think we need you anymore. I don't want to see you, right? Like where you can go away. But like that need is also underlying, right? Like when you look at all of the different people who are performing all the tasks that those of us who have had the privileges of staying home relied upon, what did those people look like, right? And so there's like this whole network of people who do all of these things that we pretend aren't happening, we pretend we don't need, and then like disrespect these things and these groups of people in this book, in addition to um again, some podcasts I was listening to. This is actually was talking about that woman who wrote Girl Wash Your Face, and I guess that she had said something, and I don't know the ethnicity of the person who was working in her home, but this idea is in my head because she was talking about like the woman who she had hired to do some cleaning at her home, and the way that she talked about her was real not full person-y, right? And it just reminded me, like, I think that there are a lot of different ways that we do this. And something that you said earlier, Shoshana, fits into this too. Like when we're talking about the decisions that people are making during the pandemic, right? And how people are pitched a little bit differently and trying to make the best decisions for them. But even inside of some of those decisions, people are making decisions about, well, I think that what I think that my child's mental health, to go to that example, I fundamentally think that that's more important than that person's physical health. And some people are not thinking about it that way at all. Like they're thinking about like, how do I, as a parent, try to do the best that I can for my kid in this moment, in this year that is passing by, that will never come back. But other people very explicitly are like, you know, I think Billy is more important than that person. And it might not be that naked, but it is like, well, if they wanted to do something else, they should have had a different job. And that is definitely tied to all of these systemic things, right? Like it's real easy to talk about somebody else's choices when you're looking at like a full deck of choices without acknowledging that that person only ever had 3 cards, which they've played very well, mind you, which they may have played better than you ever would have played, you know, the general you, those 3 cards, right? And so like thinking about the systemic stuff is making me think about like, who do we think we can throw away in one way or another? And it just feels like that's what happens, and it feels like something we don't talk about.